Okay, so we have to kick off the week with something that has brought me immense joy. Vivek Ramaswamy is a politician, and he currently did some media interviews that have turned Twitter upside down. It started off with an initial interview where he was asked by a reporter from the Washington Post about white supremacy and whether or not he would condemn it. And then it spiraled from there. So let's roll this initial clip, and then I'll get into the longer interview.
I'm not going to recite some catechism for you. I'm against vicious racial discrimination in this country. So I'm not pledging allegiance to your new religion of modern wokeism, which actually fits the test. I'm not going to bend the knee to your religion. I'm sorry. I'm not asking you to bend the knee to mine, and I'm not going to bend the knee to yours. But do I condemn vicious racial discrimination? Yes, I do. Am I going to play your silly game of gotcha? No, I'm not. And frankly, this is why people have lost trust. And I know you're going to go print the headline tomorrow. I already know this. We already know how your game works. Vivek Ramaswamy refuses to condemn white supremacy because you asked a stupid question. The reality is, I condemn vicious racial discrimination in this country, but the kind of vicious and systematic racial discrimination we see today is discrimination on the basis of race in a very different direction. You want to know what the best way is to end discrimination on the basis of race? Stop discriminating on the basis of race. Do that, and we're going to move this country forward. And I don't care whether you're black or white or brown or anything in between. That's how we're going to unite this country. You people have been responsible for dividing this country to a breaking point.
So, Brad, I think your take on this is going to be probably similar to mine, but this is on its face one of the most innocuous, obvious statements you could ever make. He is obviously condemning any kind of racism. He's speaking out against it. He's speaking to a more positive, unified future. And the one thing he's doing that's, like, I guess, a little controversial is he's calling the media out on their face. He's saying, like, you are the people who are divisive. You're the people who are stoking racial tensions. And I know what game you're playing. You're going to essentially try to make me look bad tomorrow with your headlines because I wouldn't repeat your catechism. And I love that he called it a catechism. For those who aren't familiar with that term, in Catholicism, you have to memorize catechisms when you're in school and repeat them and regurgitate them ad nauseum in order to prove, like, your allegiance to the religion. And that is essentially what they're asking him to do. There's no reason that you should have to ask this person to condemn white supremacy. It really should be a given. He's done nothing to indicate he likes white supremacists. There's no reason for him in every interview to have to be like, yes, I condemn it. Do you reject Satan? Yes, I reject Satan. Do you condemn white supremacy? Yes, I condemn white supremacy. It's ridiculous. This isn't a real question. These aren't serious media members. They really are looking for a gotcha moment. And as we'll see in just a moment, that's what they tried to turn it into.
Yeah, I'm sure the media involved in this handled it in their typical fashion, which is dishonest and trying to go after Republicans. I will say, like, I get what he's going for, but I wish you could just say, of course, I condemn it, but you're doing a trap and this is ridiculous, blah, blah, blah. There is something strange to me about a politician not being asked, do you condemn white supremacy? And they will not say yes. Like, it seems that you are feeding them that fuel, that headline of, I don't think Vivek is a white supremacist, partly because he's not white. And also there's just no reason to think that he's some secret closet self-hating racist. But I don't know, aren't you kind of giving them a layup headline to beat you up with if you won't just say something that's really easy, like, of course I condemn it, but why are you asking me this? This is race baiting, whatever, go off on your thing. But it's like, when he says he condemns vicious racial discrimination, surely that includes white supremacy. And I don't know, something about the answer does seem not ideal to me.
Well, I'm glad that you teed this up, actually, because I have a very strong pushback on that I'd love to get into. There's two problems with coalescing to this, which is what he's pushing back on. And one is that it's never enough, right? If you say it, they're still going to ask you at every single interview. They're constantly looking for any kind of way to basically turn this on your head and use it against you. But more importantly, the reason he cannot just simply say, yes, I reject white supremacy and get it over with is because they mean something very different by white supremacy than you and I mean. And I think this is something that, as a business leader, he's very high key aware of. When you have these sort of DEI programs, you have these classes that are being pushed across universities and within offices. If you want to get into the definition of what they mean by white supremacy, I don't think you would recognize your definition within it. So I have one example of many I'm going to read to you. This is from the Minnesota Historical Society, but you can find iterations of this all over the web. if you look at what they mean by white supremacy and white supremacy culture, here are a few terms that they include. And I want to be clear, I've been in these DEI instruction type classes when I worked for a criminal justice org. I've heard these things verbatim. I've had it actually told to me in interview processes that I need to keep these things in consideration, which I thought was illegal. So I want to read these to you, Brad, and tell me, do you think this is white supremacy? Okay. They say that indicators of white supremacy are perfectionism, a sense of urgency, all resources of an organization being directed towards producing measurable goals. They say that worship of the written word, including correct grammar, is white supremacy. Punctuality. Decision-making is clear to those who have power in an organization and unclear to those without it, i.e. people in leadership positions get to make decisions without consulting others. They say either or thinking is white supremacy, thinking that things are either good or bad, right or wrong, with us, against us. They say power hoarding is white supremacy. They say this would look like people throughout the organization having little shared power. So there's a hierarchical organization. Power is seen as limited. There's only so much to go around. Again, there are people in leadership and those who are not. They say an emphasis on being polite is white supremacy. Individualism, absolutely white supremacy to these people. Objectivity. They say requiring people to think in a linear fashion and ignoring or invalidating those who think in other ways. Or the belief that there is such a thing as being objective, white supremacy. So when he refuses to say, yes, I reject white supremacy, it's because he recognizes that it is a lot more of a loaded question than what it seems like on its face. And I want to roll this next clip for you. So very shortly after this first interview came out, he then was brought into NBC News for a very odd interview. For our audio listeners, I'm going to describe the setup because I've never seen an interview like this. He is being interviewed by an NBC reporter named Dasha Burns, and she's sitting there on a stool across from him, but she has like an emotional support human with her. There's another woman sitting next to her the entire.
I saw this. It was very strange.
It's very strange. And also she has like a folder that she's holding in her lap filled with like notes that she's clearly been given to grill him on from the very beginning. This interview's odd. And within the first minute, she absolutely loses her cool. So I'm going to break this up. But first, I want to roll this clip where Vivek actually calls them out on the fact that this is an entrapping kind of question and that they mean a lot more by this than what they are trying to lead people to think. So let's roll the first one.
Let's talk about white supremacy and what happened last night for a moment, because when you were talking to reporters last night, you called white supremacy a myth. When someone asked you about Dylan Roof, you said you didn't know who that is. Have you looked up what happened in 2015?
Yeah, look, I said this last night. Invidious racial discrimination is wrong no matter how it happens. But if a Washington Post reporter is asking me almost like a catechism, whatever question I said, I'm against invidious racial discrimination, whatever form it takes, but says, do you denounce white supremacy? It's incumbent on us for us to define what white supremacy is. I wrote my book, Woke Inc., and I've written about the detailed understanding of what the popular understanding of these terms have come to mean. Do you believe punctuality is a vestige of white supremacy, Dasha?
Look,
because if you don't, then you have a disagreement about many of the people who are defining those terms, or the written word, or the use, or the nuclear family. These aren't my words. These are the words of intellectual proponents from Ibram Kendi to the Ayanna Presleys to BLM that have said these are vestiges of white supremacy. So.
Yeah, so now I totally see what you meant by like white supremacy being a loaded term. I remember we've talked about this on the show in the past. It's one of those things that I think progressives very much and mainstream media folks have done the boy who cried wolf thing, right? So what I would have said, though, a couple notes still here, though, is like to not know who Dylan Roof is embarrassing. I mean, like that was one of the most horrific mass shootings and racist hate crimes in recent American history in South Carolina. So to not know who that is for a presidential candidate is embarrassing that he just admitted that. But also, what I would say then is, yes, of course, I condemn real white supremacy. Right, actual KKK, neo-Nazis, the Nick Fuenteses of the world. Now, you guys should really stop diluting the term by conflating it with X, Y, and Z, because that's not white supremacy. So I don't condemn punctuality. I don't condemn hierarchical structures at a business. But I, of course, condemn real white supremacy. I think, I don't know, I can see both sides of it. But with this kind of thing, it seems like you're just playing, you're giving, like the reason that this follow-up interview devolved into more conversations about white supremacy is because of his first answer. Whereas if he just said, of course I condemn it, I don't think it would have. I think he could have moved on and talked about something substantive. So I don't really think, and it's just fine if we just see it differently, but I don't really think either side covered themselves in glory in this whole exchange.
Well, I think that's a fair point. And I will say, I think your answer you just gave is better. Maybe you'd be a better candidate than this person would be. I don't know. But I do think that he is more concerned with pushing back on wokeism. As he says, he wrote a whole book on this. This is, a pillar of his whole message. And look, when it comes to knowing decades old crimes, do I think it's weird you don't remember Dylan Roof? I guess, yes, a little bit. But like, I'm listening to a podcast right now on Aaron Hernandez murdering a bunch of people. Do you know who that is?
Yeah, former Patriots player.
Yeah. So like, very famous, big case. I have no memory of it. I was texting my brothers about it today and I'm like, how famous was he when this happened? Like, I don't remember this happening at all. So my point being, like, just because something is a huge national news story does not mean that every single person is paying attention to it. And I think her larger point, and most of the less larger point that she's trying to make, this worldview she's trying to push, is that white supremacy is all over the place, that it's growing in numbers, that it's this huge pressing threat. And I don't believe that that is true. And the fact that you're having to point to a case that happened over 10 years ago, I mean, I don't think that that's really valid. I think you are clutching at straws.
Did he actually call white supremacy a myth, or did she just say that?
I think she just said that. And at the end of the day, he at every turn, multiple times already in the first minute of this clip, has said, I condemn racism. I condemn actual racism, but I'm not going to sit here and bow the knee and pretend that your worldview is accurate. And so she then does, in this next clip, something that I think is so unprofessional, so outside the realm of normalcy in an interview with a member of the media. It's quite clear that she's actually trying to debate him. She's so desperate to get her worldview in there that she won't even let him talk. So I want to roll this second clip briefly.
Mr. Ramaswamy,
we can't have it both ways.
What you do, though.
We have to have an honest discussion.
Straw man arguments.
This is not a straw man.
You brought up Jussie Smollett as the best example of white supremacy.
Was the hottest thing in news in the back of a fake actual attack on him that we have to contend with.
And yet you have examples like the Buffalo shooter in New York just in 2022.
You have other examples.
But you are also cherry picking when you bring up Jussie Smollett.
I'll look at all of the statistics. More black on black crime. If you really care about actual crime against black Americans, let's get to the root causes of it in the inner cities of this country.
The Anti-Defamation League tracked a 38% increase in white supremacist propaganda last year.
Who's tracking that?
The Anti-Defamation League.
Yeah, the ADL, I don't think is a particularly credible source when they have cherry-picked information.
When we're talking about
I would suggest look at there's a table, 2x2 table. Federal law enforcement data, which you could say what you do. Maybe we shouldn't believe that either. But look at black on Asian crime, black on black crime,
the FBI
white on
hate
black
crime statistics. That's a law enforcement agency. 59.1% was based on race, ethnicity, and ancestry, saying hate crimes rose 12% between 2020 and 2021.
Look at the absolute crimes themselves. What they classify as a hate crime is itself a political judgment. I think that when you actually care about protecting life, if you want to say Black Lives Matter, let's look at where black lives are actually being lost.
So, I'll just say that is not what a journalist is supposed to be like. That seems like you're on the debate stage against another candidate. I mean, it's part of a journalist's job to ask tough questions, ask follow-up questions, point out factual challenges to something they're saying, but constantly interrupting and yelling and talking over like that and not even letting them really fully answer a question isn't really a proper, that's not journalism, that's activism. And so I think this is sadly typical of how a lot of the press increasingly treats Republican candidates, but it's not what journalism should look or sound like.
I mean, she's frantic. She seems like she's about to cry. She is so desperate to try to push back. And it reminded me of my interview that I did a couple weeks ago with the communism people, where I just couldn't even get a word in. They kept trying to talk over me every time I would point out a fact. They are so conditioned to being surrounded by other people who think like them into these safe spaces that their ability to even hear and listen to somebody push back on something that challenges that, you see them immediately start to just sort of freak out, and they're trying to talk over you and they're trying to shut it down. And she's just throwing like every little random fact she can at him. And I thought this was completely unprofessional. I think this should be shown in broadcast journalism schools as a how not to conduct yourself in the media, because you're right. This isn't asking questions. This isn't an interview. At this point, you're just trying to debate him pretty much. It's totally unprofessional. And in the midst of it all, the thing I like best about this is that while she is absolutely becoming emotional and just kind of like frantically throwing facts from her notebook that she has stacked in front of her, where she's clearly come, prepared to try to like convince him that her worldview is correct. He's got nothing in front of him. He's staying calm and he's just shooting her down left and right. And he does make a few really funny points, I thought. So first and foremost, the fact that she tried to use the ADL as her source to prove that racism is just rampant, that white supremacy is everywhere, it's funny on many layers. First and foremost, the stat that she actually cites is the ADL saying that the amount of hate speech propaganda is up, meaning the amount of speech they don't like online that they consider hate speech has increased. How do they measure this? How is that quantified? Good question. I went to their website to see if they gave any indication of how they actually tracked that kind of statistic, and I couldn't really find much on the sourcing, right? I saw many articles they have claiming that there's all this increase in hate speech and they have all these issues with people online, and that could be true. I also don't know how they're in any way actually measuring that. But secondarily, this is just people's speech. It is not people actually doing anything to harm other people. It's not really actual incidents you can point to. And he very quickly laughs off the ADL as the joke that it is. It's not a serious organization. It's mostly an anti-free speech organization. They've done numerous things actually throughout their history to try to suppress free speech. A few years ago, they actually were pushing an Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which was a bill that would have created a federal authority to decide whether a critic of Israel was motivated by politics or anti-Semitic intent, because the federal government should be examining people's intentions and criticizing Israel. They've also advocated surveillance of Muslim communities. They have multiple tweets, if you scroll through their timeline, saying that anybody who is an anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic. And what's interesting to me about her citing them is that they're actually really hated by the real left. Like, progressives don't like the ADL. I found numerous articles. We can link these in our show notes. One says that under the guise of fighting hate speech, the ADL has a long history of wielding its moral authority to attack Arabs, blacks, and queers. Another says ADL is not an ally. The ADL has branded itself as a civil rights organization in ways that conceal and legitimize its right-wing activities, undermining the rights of black, immigrant, queer, Muslim, Arab, and other marginalized communities. So it's just kind of funny to me, like, picking and choosing when you're going to cite the ADL as somebody on the left, because they aren't really somebody that holds that much respect. I certainly don't respect them.
They're viewed very much as a partisan, center-left establishment institution, and their credibility has really waned in recent years, especially with how the hyperbolic and alarmist way they handled the Trump era at times. They have supported a lot of social media censorship efforts. I agree. So then I love how he goes to like FBI data, and she wants to point to a small increase in hate crimes, but that's like year over year. It's still, I mean, also not all of those are, maybe not even most of them are carried out by white people or white supremacists. One thing that doesn't get talked about with hate crimes is sometimes it's one minority group onto another, and the absolute numbers are pretty small. So even if it went up some percent year over year, it's still not a very common occurrence. And that's actually good news, right? We don't want this to be a big problem, but they seem to. They seem to very much want it to be a big problem and boogeyman. But all I'll say is this. I just think that it plays into them a little bit when you don't condemn it, or when you do kind of dodge a question, or like Trump's whole, the very, and it's actually complicated. What did he say? What did he not say? But the very messy and haphazard way he's talked about condemning white supremacy or not in the past has left half the country with the impression that Trump doesn't condemn white supremacy. And maybe he should have just been very clear about it all along and avoided that whole catastrophe in PR during his presidency. So I don't know. Like, and also I'll say this, I get that Vivek is coming from an anti-woke place, as am I, but I almost think it hurts the anti-woke movement when you're tying it to like anti-woke people won't even condemn white supremacy. It's like, well, actually, I think anti-woke people, classically liberal people who want like colorblindness and equality under the law and all these things are the least racist, right? The least offensive or controversial. You have the woke racism, and then you have the alt-right racism. I actually think they're the most sensible, but I'm afraid that you dilute or tar that position a little bit when you do play these word games. But I think more than anything, Vivek is up for a fight, and he's found success and popularity fighting the media, and there's definitely something to appreciate about that.
Yeah, and I also think that people want to see a fight over these things. They're sick of having to capitulate on these issues. They're sick of being told that you should feel shame, you should feel guilty for things that you've never done when you have no racism in your heart, no racist intent. They're tired of this kind of game. And so I see what you're saying. And I think if he were refusing to condemn racism at all, I would have more of an issue on that. I think he's being pretty clear, though, and making the distinction for anybody who's watching this with like an intellectually honest eye. He's being clear that he does condemn racism over and over and over, but he is refusing to capitulate to her worldview. And I want to point out one more thing before I move on to our last clip, which is, she mentions hate crimes and how they're increasing allegedly 12% according to the FBI. Hate crimes are BS. And I want to be very, very clear on that. It's another one of those things that gets thrown around mostly to try to use as a weapon against lawmakers. They voted against this hate crime legislation. People in criminal justice reform hate hate crime laws. They are very, very bad, maybe well-intentioned public policy, but do not have good ramifications. They don't work. They lead to over-incarceration. They are disproportionately actually used against more marginalized populations because guess who mostly goes to jail in this country? Guess who mostly gets arrested in this country? It's people of color. Ipso facto, those enhancements are more likely actually to get weaponized against the very populations they're supposed to serve. So that's one reason that many people do not like them when you actually get into criminal justice policy. They're also not enforced all that much. It's really hard to say how many hate crimes actually happen. And that's for two reasons. One, first and foremost, we don't solve that many crimes. Most crimes aren't even reported to police. So it's really hard to say what kind of criminality and what kind of intent is actually occurring beneath all the crimes that we don't solve or catch. And that gets into why even when we do solve and catch a crime, prosecutors often choose not to pursue hate crime enhancements. And I read this piece in The Atlantic that actually talked to several different prosecutors about why this is. And they said it's impossible to know what's in someone's heart. Jurors faced with evidence that a perpetrator acted for multiple reasons will often acquit on an added hate crime charge because they're unwilling to treat bias as the sole or predominant motive in a crime, as many hate crime statutes actually require. And even when they do feel like they could prove it, they say it's not worth their time and energy. So there's multiple problems with hate crime laws, but especially when you get into overcharging. The same article said some prosecutors may also bring hate crime charges in cases that don't appear to support them as a way to gain leverage in plea negotiations, which is very typical. They'll often throw the book at somebody in plea negotiations to get them to cop to a crime so that they don't have to go through the burden of a trial. And they found that in New York State, where age is a protected category, that includes anyone over 60 or older, prosecutors have included hate crime charges in swindling cases that involved elderly victims, but where there was no evidence of animus towards the elderly. By charging defendants suspected of stealing less than $1 million with hate crimes, New York prosecutors have obtained plea deals that include actual prison time. So are hate crimes actually increasing? Who could say? They're such a problematic category, and yet this is what she's hinging her arguments on. So I think even though she wants a debate right here, and even though she brought a whole notebook and an extra human to back her up, she wasn't ready for this fight. And finally, towards the end of the interview, when Vivek finally gets to actually speak, I think you will see, Brad, that he really does expand upon his views in a way that will feel more satisfactory towards you. So let's roll this last clip.
Denying that racism is a problem.
I've never denied that racism is a problem. And if you listen to the response I gave to that black pastor, my whole point is racism has been a major problem for most of our national history. But we're getting close to the promised land that Martin Luther King envisioned. We're as darn close to it as we ever have been. And so what bothers the heck out of me is it's right when we're close to that promised land. Martin Luther King said it, I may not get there with you, and he didn't get there with us. But I think it desecrates the legacy of our civil rights movement, desecrates the legacy of Martin Luther King, that right when we get closest to the point of having racial equality and gender equality and even opportunities for people of minorities of many types, are we perfect? No. But are we as close as we've ever been? Yes, we have. To then obsess over systemic racism, to then obsess over white guilt and otherwise, we're creating new waves of racism, Dasha, that we otherwise would have avoided right when we're closest to having achieved what even the proponents of the civil rights movement would have dreamed of. That's what bothers me. My exchange with that black pastor about a week or so ago, right here in Iowa, not far from where we are, it was in Indianola, not far from where we are in Des Moines, was that we're founded on the pursuit of a more perfect union, the pursuit of liberty, equality, and justice for all. And I reject this left-wing narrative that's creating more artificial division.
Yeah, so I definitely agree strongly with that last part, that the left-wing obsession with identity and race is actually serving to reinforce those divides and make them more prevalent rather than let them fade into the background. I mean, we see this with affirmative action, right? Where it's actually now pitted Asian Americans against Black Americans because their new racially discriminatory policy helps one racial group and hurts another. And so now, of course, that's been struck down. So hopefully those programs will be changed and done away with that were racially discriminatory against Asians. But when you have this woke idea of race obsessed, race conscious policies, it absolutely does reinforce the races and the divides, when I think most normal people just want those things to be irrelevant, want race to be like eye color or hair color and not something really most people care about in any meaningful way. Well, I think Vivek is totally right that the woke approach, or the left-wing social progressive approach to these issues, is not furthering that goal. It's actually taking us backwards. So definitely fully on board with him on that point.
And I mean, I think it's interesting to note, and this is increasingly something I'm noticing across these kinds of discussions, that the people who are pushing this identity sort of belief system the most are white people. I even saw another interview that Jonah Goldberg did from National Review with two other DEI leaders, both white women, where they admitted that like over 75% of people leading DEI programs in this country were white men. And they did it as like this mic drop, trying to be like, see, too much patriarchy and racism. We need these programs still. And I was like, what? That's the biggest self-own I've ever heard. Like, I very rarely find Black people, or any people of color actually, leading in these DEI spaces. And I think it's because if you actually go and talk to people who are the most likely to suffer from something, you're going to be more likely to get the real solutions to it, right? And I am somebody who cares deeply about racism. I'm somebody who has spoken out extensively about systemic racism, which I do think is a thing. But what they are doing under these programs and under this ideology absolutely is incurring blowback. And it's doing so in such a way that it doesn't actually uphold or uplift or empower the communities they're supposed to be serving. And that's why they are noticeably absent from these discussions, and often even the ones pushing back on it, as we see here with Vivek, who is a man of Indian descent. So it's just very ironic to watch this. And I think that if you get offline, you go out in the world, I don't think you see racism. I just don't. And I live in Atlanta. I live in a very diverse community. It's not something that is really all over the place, that's rampant. I think you mostly see it online, and I'm sure it's worse in some pockets of communities. But I think that Vivek's right here, that we have made tremendous strides in this country in a unfathomable short period of time on these issues. When you think about the fact that my parents, when they were born into a country where segregation was legal. My parents, I just turned 36. I'm a 36-year-old woman.
That's crazy.
Insane. That's insane. And so to try to diminish that is absolutely disrespectful to the people who gave their lives, many white people who also gave their lives in order to overturn this system of oppression and in order to change a culture that saw a certain group of people as less than and reverse that. I mean, I think it's phenomenal, the gains that have been made. And to diminish that is so disrespectful to the legacy of people who fought a very hard uphill battle and won. And that should be celebrated, and we should be allowed to move forward from that. And they want to keep dragging us back down because it benefits them. It benefits them monetarily. It benefits them politically. And I think it is about time we start standing up to people like he does here. I think he did it in a way that I wholeheartedly stood behind. And I think that it's empowering to other people to see somebody like this handle this in this way and refuse to capitulate on it and refuse to bow down and back off, even if you get called names. So I loved this. Well, I loved it on Vivek's behalf. He stayed very calm and consistent throughout. It was an infuriating interview to watch, but Dasha Burns, man, get a grip.
Yeah.